There are some smiles that make people uncomfortable, not because they look evil, but because they look empty. In a Summit County courtroom, 23-year-old Cydney Powell sat quietly beside her attorneys while cameras focused on her expression. At moments, she appeared emotionless. At others, she smiled faintly at inappropriate times. To many watching the trial, it looked chilling, like the face of someone completely detached from the horror she had caused. But inside the courtroom, another explanation emerged. By the time the trial began, Cydney had already been diagnosed with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. She was heavily medicated with antipsychotic drugs like Abilify and anti-anxiety medication, including Ativan. Doctors testified that the medication often flattened emotional responses, distorted facial expression, and created what psychiatrists call a blunted affect. So what exactly were people seeing? Was that smile proof of a cold-blooded killer? Or was it the final visible crack in a mind that had already collapsed long before the murder ever happened? That question would divide an entire courtroom. Because this case was never just about a daughter killing her mother, it became a battle over something much darker, the terrifying moment when reality itself begins to break apart. Before her death, Brenda Powell spent nearly 3 decades helping children and families survive some of the worst moments imaginable. She worked at Akron Children's Hospital as a child life specialist in the hematology-oncology unit, guiding seriously ill children through fear, pain, and grief. Friends described her as patient, warm, and emotionally intelligent. Ironically, the woman who helped strangers navigate emotional trauma could not see the darkness quietly growing inside her own daughter. People close to the family described Brenda and Cydney as inseparable. They were more than mother and daughter. They were best friends. Steve Powell, Cydney's father, would later describe their bond as unbreakable. And maybe that is what makes the story so disturbing. Nothing about Cydney Powell looked dangerous from the outside. She had been an honors student, a scholarship athlete, a teenager who played soccer and lacrosse. Teachers described her as bright and kind. She earned a presidential scholarship to the University of Mount Union and seemed to have a future filled with opportunity. But somewhere beneath that image, something had already begun to fracture. Years before the murder, Cydney suffered multiple concussions while playing soccer. Defense experts later argued that repeated head trauma may have affected her neurological development and increased vulnerability to severe mental illness. At college, her behavior slowly changed. She became withdrawn, anxious, exhausted all the time. Some days, she reportedly slept up to 16 hours. Friends noticed panic attacks and emotional instability. Professors noticed she was disappearing academically. But the most disturbing part was not the failure itself. It was what happened after. Instead of accepting reality, Cydney appeared to create a new one. When she was academically suspended from Mount Union, she never told her parents. She continued carrying her backpack around campus. She pretended to attend classes she was no longer enrolled in. She wandered through locked university buildings. She maintained conversations about homework and assignments that no longer existed. For months, she performed an entire fake life. The prosecution called it manipulation. The defense called it psychological collapse. Because according to multiple psychiatric experts, Cydney wasn't simply lying to others anymore. She may have been lying to herself. And eventually, that false reality became impossible to maintain. On March 3, 2020, everything finally began falling apart. Steve Powell discovered that his daughter was no longer enrolled in school. Brenda started calling university administrators, trying to understand what was happening. Hours later, she returned home to speak with Cydney face to face. According to testimony, before the violence erupted, Brenda sat beside her daughter on the couch and tried to comfort her. She hugged her. She reportedly told her, "Everything is going to be okay." The defense would later argue that this moment mattered more than anyone realized, because for months, Cydney had built her entire identity around avoiding failure, avoiding humiliation, avoiding the truth. And suddenly, the one person whose opinion mattered most finally knew everything. Psychiatrists described what may have happened next as an acute psychotic break, a total collapse of the false reality she had spent months trying to preserve. During a phone call with university officials, loud, banging noises suddenly erupted through the speaker. Then came screams. According to investigators, Cydney attacked her mother with a cast iron skillet before stabbing her repeatedly. Brenda suffered more than 30 stab wounds. The brutality shocked even veteran investigators. But strangely, the defense argued that the violence itself supported the insanity claim, because in their words, this level of overkill screams psychosis. Then came the moment that changed the entire trial. After the attack, university officials repeatedly called Brenda's phone back. On the third attempt, someone answered. Yes, this is Brenda. But it wasn't Brenda. It was Cydney, pretending to be her mother. That single sentence became the emotional center of the case. For prosecutors, it proved consciousness of guilt. They argued that someone capable of impersonating the victim immediately after the murder clearly understood right from wrong. But defense experts saw something entirely different. They argued Cydney was desperately trying to preserve the false reality she had been living in for months, a confused psychological attempt to stop reality from crashing down completely. Not calculation, delusion. The jury had to decide which explanation made more sense. And maybe that is why this case became so emotionally divisive, because even after Brenda died, her own family did not want Cydney treated like a monster. Steve Powell begged prosecutors not to pursue the case aggressively. Brenda's mother did the same. They believed Cydney needed psychiatric treatment more than punishment. While awaiting trial, Cydney reportedly improved dramatically once stabilized on medication. Family members described her as calmer, clearer, and emotionally present again. But prosecutors insisted that mental illness alone could not erase responsibility. And after years of delays, the case finally went to trial in 2023. The courtroom became a war between psychiatry and criminal law. 3 defense experts concluded that Cydney was experiencing severe psychosis during the murder and could not fully understand the wrongfulness of her actions. The state's expert disagreed. She argued that Cydney showed signs of anxiety and personality disorder traits, but not insanity. More importantly, she claimed the elaborate deception before and after the murder demonstrated awareness, planning, and self-preservation. In September 2023, the jury found Cydney Powell guilty. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. In a shocking legal twist, an appeals court later overturned the conviction, not because Cydney was declared innocent, but because the trial judge had denied the defense the opportunity to present a rebuttal witness after the prosecution's expert challenged their psychiatric methodology during testimony. Now the case sits before the Ohio Supreme Court, raising larger questions about how the justice system handles defendants suffering from severe mental illness. And maybe that is the most disturbing part of all. Not the violence, not the lies, but the uncertainty. Because society feels comfortable judging evil. Evil is simple. Evil is easier to punish. Mental illness is not. What happens when someone commits an unimaginable crime while their mind is collapsing underneath them? What if they truly cannot separate reality from delusion? Should prison become punishment or treatment? Even today, those questions remain unanswered. After the murder, while sitting inside a psychiatric hospital, Cydney reportedly muttered the same phrase over and over again: "Get out." According to medical staff, she claimed she could not remember killing her mother. Maybe she was lying. Maybe she wasn't. And somewhere between those two possibilities lies the terrifying heart of this entire case.